please pray with me. May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me, and may these words that you hear be captured by your soul, enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. I wonder what it would have been like to be part of those early Jewish Christian communities, hearing those very familiar texts from the Hebrew Bible, followed by a new story about Jesus on a similar theme. For the similarities in the two passages we heard read today are both striking and significant. On one hand, this was intended to legitimize Jesus as the new leader, the new spokesperson for God, by connecting the story of their revered prophet Elijah to the life of Jesus. The difference is that Jesus is portrayed as bigger, more powerful. Both Elijah and Jesus feel deep compassion for a widow who has lost her only son. Elijah, in raising the son, calls on God, beseeching God to intervene, and then lays on the boy 3 times. And I have a bit of trouble with that image, but lays on the boy 3 times. He has to make physical contact and breathes the breath of life into this child. Jesus, on the other hand, in raising the son, simply touches the bier. He doesn't even touch the son, and commands him to rise. Jesus performs the same act, but already has the power of God within him to restore life. This is the change that Jesus brought to his followers, that one no longer needed to call upon God's power from above to intervene, but rather they need only draw on the power of God within them and around them to offer a healing love. But the similarities in the story also point to something else. It tells us that these stories are not historical fact, but rather they are symbolic narratives intended to show us the power of God to heal or to restore life. Too often these stories have been interpreted as physical miracle stories. Someone raised back from death to life, physical death to life. And when they're interpreted that way, the focus is on the sons being raised back to life from death. But I don't believe that is the main point of these stories. Rather, as symbolic narrative, we are being asked to look beyond the raising the dead, which I cannot accept as ever actually happening. To ask the question, who is really restored to life in these stories? Which dead person actually has been restored to life? For me, it is the widows. After all, it is the widows who are the central characters. It is the widows who are named in the little titles above these passages in both Kings and Luke. Unfortunately, we don't know their names. You see, in ancient Mediterranean culture, women must be under the care of a key man, a father, a brother, a husband, or a son. A widow was particularly vulnerable because without a husband, she could only return to her own family. And that could only happen if her own family was willing to pay back the original wedding dowry. Well, the reality is that 99% of the time, that didn't happen, because daughters were not considered of enough value to be bothered paying back. So they were left on their own. Families would simply disown a widowed daughter. A son was the only way to survive. And now both widows in these stories have lost their only sons, their only source of support, and their last connection to their husbands' families. These are dire straits. The other fact of this culture is that the closest family bond was between a mother and a son. The weakest was between a husband and a wife. And that's because the marriages were arranged, and they were usually with first cousins, and so the bonds were different. They were bonds of convenience and property. Also, women had no identity in this culture until they bore a son. So you see, the sons are dead, but so are the widows. Because in their societies, they are now worthless outcasts. They have physical life, but it is bereft of meaning. And in this culture, healing is understood as the restoration of meaning to life. Healing is the restoration of meaning to life. Just as this story in Kings comes very near the beginning of Elijah's mission as a prophet of God, so this story in Luke comes very near the beginning of Jesus' mission as a prophet of God. It was common to align stories in that way. In the previous chapter in Luke, Jesus has called the 12 disciples and then spends the rest of that chapter instructing them on exactly what discipleship means, ending with one of the most important statements that Jesus utters. He says to his disciples, "Be compassionate as God is compassionate." Luke 6:16. The next two stories are acts of compassion performed by Jesus. And in both cases, the first one is the healing of a centurion's slave, and the second one is the healing of the widow of Nain. In both those cases, his compassion begins with outcasts. Both widows' stories are not about curing the sons. They are about healing, restoring life to the widows through compassion, through a healing love that says to them, they are worth something. They are valuable. And they are able to have a full life. There is no question for me that it is these widows rather than the sons who have the greatest meaning restored to their lives. So Jesus calls the 12 and then performs these healings, not to prove how great and powerful he is, which is where we go if we focus on the raising of the dead, but rather to show by his compassion for another how his disciples can also offer healing love to those they meet. I believe we are being called by these stories to pay attention to what restored life means for us, both personally and as community. What in me and what in you is in need of healing love? And who in our community is in need of our healing love? These past few months, I have been walking with a number of people in this community and walking with their families that are facing serious illness. Some are life-threatening. As a pastor, I need to understand that calling on the power of God is not about asking God for a cure. although some may experience that. But I don't believe God takes life. That understanding of God, for me, is an old way, and not a very helpful way to understand how life works. I do believe I am calling upon the Spirit of God in us, between us, and around us to bring healing to every life, to restore meaning to every life. For even in illness that has no cure, there is always the possibility of healing, of restoring meaning to whatever portion of life remains. This is the kind of healing that Jesus did so well, a healing rooted in compassion for another that gave their life meaning and purpose once again. They knew they were loved. This is the kind of healing that made Jesus both famous and infamous in his time, because it brought life back to people in ways that their culture and society could not. So take a moment now to ask yourself, each of you, what healing would restore meaning to my life? Is there a relationship that needs attention? Is there a hurt that needs letting go? Is there a hope that needs rekindling? Is there a love that needs to be spoken? Is there a prayer that needs to be said? Take a moment and ask, what healing would restore meaning to my life? As I pondered that question for myself this past week, I touched some very deep places that are in need of healing. And I wonder if something stirred deep in your soul as you pondered this kind of healing today. And can you imagine how that you might make that healing happen? For it is only when we can heal ourselves that we can then bring unending healing love to others. Only then that we can walk in the compassionate footsteps of Elijah and Jesus to experience our own and to be able to offer to others a healing love.